Hello and welcome to the February. Sorry. Hello and welcome. This is Reija from the book Finch, and this is the March live show for Shorts and Sorcery Book Club, which is a book club that I host every month, uh, where we read anthologies and short story collections and short story magazines in the speculative fiction and SFF genre. And this month, or rather in February, we read FIYAH Magazine issue 20. And normally I would have a co host to discuss the book or magazine with me, but this month I am doing this by myself, so therefore the live show is a little bit shorter. I am expecting to go for about 30 minutes to 1 hour, depending on how much I have to say for each of these stories. And first of all, I have to say that I basically was super busy during the month of February, so it took me a while to even get to the point where I had enough time to finish reading the magazine. But once I got into it, it was really nice. I have a bunch of books in this. I have a bunch of stories in this magazine that I really liked, and at least one that I am actually going to be nominating for the Hugos, because I am doing my nominations like this weekend, because the Hugo nomination period ends on March 15th. So I'm gonna be nominating my noms for the Hugo Awards, and there is a story in this magazine that I definitely will vote for, and I will mention which one I'm gonna vote for as I'm talking about this. So the FIYAH Magazine is all about celebrating like Black culture and Black SFF creators and Black stories and experiences, and also other like marginalized creators. And this theme for this month was like love, robots, and death. And I definitely got a lot of like death and robots from this, but not necessarily a lot of the love, except for the nonfiction piece for this magazine. But it was definitely very enjoyable to read. I didn't have a single story where I felt like I wanted to like DNF it or that I wasn't enjoying it. So this was a very strong piece, I think. So first of all, we have the fiction, which I'm actually going to touch on last because I feel like I have most to say about the fiction pieces. So the table of contents was in fiction side, we have The First of Us, the Gordon story by K.S. Walker, and then Smiley Faces with Blackberry Jam on Toast by Cynthia S. Scott, Performance Review by Marian Mohammed, The Trumpet Player by Nicole Givens-Kurtz, and The Body of Theseus by Emir G. Park. And then we have poetry, which I'm going to actually talk about first, and Explaining Bot Fights to Bobby by Abu Bakr Sadiq, and When I Fell Apart, My Mother Put Me Back Together by Renee S. Christopher. So I'm going to actually talk about those first. There is also a nonfiction essay called The Answer by Kay Albert, which touches on the importance of community. But I am personally someone who hasn't really gotten into genre poetry specifically. I do read a lot of poetry, especially Finnish poetry, and I do enjoy reading it. But like poetry that touches on genre themes, especially like science fiction themes, is something that I'm very new to. and that's why I feel like I don't have as much to say about poetry, because I'm still learning about it and trying to understand my own experience with it, my own stance on it, and like trying to sort of lean into the experience instead of resisting it, if that makes sense. So there's 2 poems in this magazine, and I feel like they are very narratively driven poems, especially explaining bot fights to Bobby. Seems to like convey this idea of how important it is to like fight. Like it has this narrative structure that there is a sort of this fighting competition where robots are doing the fighting, and they are also kind of like remotely operated by people. And the narrative structure of the poem is basically like first explaining what the fighting is about, and then sort of going over like how the bots are treated and what happens to them. But while I understood the like plain narrative style and the narrative choices of the poem, I didn't actually understand the like what it was trying to be a metaphor for. Like it kind of flew over my head. I mean, it was cool and all as a story. Like you have this person explaining about this thing that is the bot fight, but other than that, I didn't really get much out of it. I didn't really manage to pry out all the different layers of it. So this one was probably my least favorite piece of the entire magazine. I just did not understand it as much. And then the other poem was When I Fell Apart, My Mother Put Me Back Together by Renee S. Christopher. And this one, I felt like I understood the metaphor a lot. This is basically about a parent-child relationship, and about the ways in which a parental figure can help in your healing process, and how it's kind of like almost safe to break apart in front of someone who you know is safe to like help you. But that's just my interpretation. I feel like this poem could have many other interpretations as well, especially like depending on what lens you come to it from. Like, do you come to this poem with the experience of having a sort of balanced, loving family, or not? I feel like that would kind of reflect on your reading of the poem, because the poem itself is very like cerebral. It isn't really like, the parental figure is definitely referred to as a human, a living, breathing, like fleshy being, like they are a human. And then the child character is insinuated to be an android or a robot. But I felt like it's almost like this metaphor for a butterfly, like kind of like a parental figure will also guide your growth up to a point. So I thought that this was interesting, and the fact that I'm even thinking about it this much and trying to piece it out means that this poem was successful in the sense that it made me think and reflect. So I enjoyed this much more than the first poem. And then I want to talk about the fiction parts of this magazine, starting with The First of Us, the Gordon story by K.S. Walker. This is kind of like a documentary style. It has like these information pieces in the brackets where they're talking about like found footage and references to like video and audio and stuff. And then you have interviews of these different point of view characters. and they're all reflecting on this boy that was basically taken in by alien entities and then raised by them. And it's talking about how that boy has changed and whether society has failed him by allowing this to happen to him, and is he human or not, and sort of trying to piece information together about this boy who has turned into this um, sort of symbol for alien human connection, and a symbol for failed oversight when it comes to like dealing with children who are taken into like a foster system. I thought that it was interesting. The basic premise was really fun, but I just feel like these sorts of documentary style stories, they can be the documentary format in itself can be a little bit of a crutch, because you don't have to necessarily do as much world building as you would if you went in with a more traditional narrative structure for the story. You can just sort of do this stream of consciousness style moments in a story instead of like trying to do an overarching like plot driven traditional narrative, and that means that there is the chance that the documentary style becomes a sort of like gimmick and a crutch instead of being a tool for that kind of more traditional narrative to flourish, if you know what I mean. So, not my favorite. I thought that it was interesting. It dealt with a bunch of interesting ideas, and this idea of like a child like moving through the foster care system and being left to the care of some ambiguous entity that may necessarily not mean well, was interesting. But I just personally did not like the story format, mostly because I feel like I see this a lot now. I feel like the sort of documentary interview style of science fiction storytelling is everywhere now, and it's in short story collections. Like I have read at least 4 different stories just in the past like 6 months or so that utilize this format. So I'm starting to become a little tired of it, and therefore this story just did not wow me as much as it would have if I had read it like, let's say, a year ago or something. If a story like that this had come up for me a year ago, I would have been more impressed because it would have been more fresh in my eyes. But now that I've read more stories that are written in a similar way to this, I'm like, okay, I'm past the gimmick. Now I need the story, and if the story isn't developed enough, the gimmick becomes a hindrance in a sense. So yeah, that's my opinion of The First of Us, the Gordon story by Chaos Walker. And then is my favorite story of the entire magazine, and this is the one that I am going to nominate for a Hugo Award, which is Smiley Faces with Blackberry Jam on Toast by Cynthia S. Scott. This was so beautifully written, and this is kind of like, it talks about humanity and what makes us human, and what is the difference between a human and a machine. And it also talks about this sort of parental guilt about putting your career in front of your child, this sort of idea of the pressure to make money and to stay employed, and therefore like having to choose to miss those important milestones in your child's life. And also this idea of if I let my child be reared by in this case an AI, or someone who is purposefully built to seem inferior to us, what does it teach the child about the world and about interactions with other people, and what sort of value system does that instill in the child? And also there's this idea of grief, of expendability, and this idea that, okay, when the AI, the machine, inevitably breaks, what is left? How do we deal with it? Can we grieve for it? Is that even something that should be done? And how does it affect the child who was cared for by this entity? It had all like these really interesting philosophical ideas going around, and it was such a beautifully written story. And I felt like what I got out of it most was this idea of separation anxiety almost. And I just really liked it a lot. And this idea of replaceability almost, like when someone leaves us, like, and we grieve for them, and then immediately we are pressured to move on, to get over it and replace that person. Like that is something that happens in interpersonal connections all the time. Like when you lose someone, like you lose a grandparent or something, and the society around you immediately expects that, okay, you have now had your moment to grieve, and now you should be able to bounce back and get back to the hamster wheel in a sense. I just thought that this was such a beautifully written story, and yeah, I am gonna nominate it. This was my favorite personally. I really enjoyed it. It was touching, and yeah. I will say that there were parts where I felt like the relationship between the main character and the husband character was not as fleshed out as I would have liked to, and the child does not really appear in the story as a character of their own. The child is more like the vehicle to have the sort of nanny character, the babysitter character, the AI, be in the story. So those were the weak aspects, but they were not like they were not weak enough to deter me from the whole story. I thought that the story as a whole was very good. And then the next story was Performance Review by Mariam Mohammed. And this one was also very good. I liked it a lot. This one also plays with this idea of having glimpses into this AI robot's life, interspersed with times when the robot is taken back to the manufacturer for repairs because the robot gets sent back as a faulty device, a faulty good. It gets returned, and then people reboot it and put it back into circulation. So it's basically what I got from this story was basically the how easily we replace human connections, and how easily we replace relationships when the other person in the relationship is not giving us what we want, or we deem that the other person is not worthy of our time because they don't perform in a way that we expect. And I felt like that was what was communicated in the story through this AI, who is trying to learn about human behavior and trying to do the tasks that its owners wanted to do, but it keeps failing at it. And the reason it keeps failing is because it is not meeting the expectations of the end user. So the fault is not necessarily on the robot itself, who is doing the task that it needs to do, but on the end user who doesn't even understand that that what they are expecting, that they are approaching this robot from a faulty premise to begin with. And it was really interesting. I really liked how sort of snappy the writing was. It is very much tightly written, and very like fast paced and snappy. And yeah, I especially liked the last part of the story where the robot is with its last set of owners before the story ends, because you kind of get this idea that okay, there is hope for this robot. Um, it's gonna work out in its favor, and then things happen, and once again, these expectations that humans have for each other come to play, and the relationships kind of falls apart because of that. So very interesting story. Also would highly recommend um, everyone to read this. Like, I feel like out of this magazine, if you don't have much time and you just want to read one or two stories, I would say that the stories by Cynthia Escott, The Smiley Faces with Blackberry Jam on Toast, and this story by Marian Mohammed, Performance Review, were the standouts. Um, with For me personally, Smiley Faces with Blackberry Jam on Toast edging above Performance Review just a tiny bit. Also, hi Joe, thanks for joining me. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter live stream today because I am by myself, so I'm just basically giving you a review of each story before I sign off. Yeah, the next one is Trumpet Player by Nicole Givens-Kurtz, and this one was my least favorite. I just felt like it didn't really do anything for me. This is basically this trumpet player takes place in a world where there has been a robot uprising, and there is still a sort of civil rights struggle going on with robots trying to gain the same rights as humans. And the main character of the story is a robot who is a jazz trumpet player, and he is moving to Mars to pursue a new life in a mostly robot like biodome, a robot city, and he wants to kind of stay away from places where he would be put under the leadership of humans. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to find his own way, and he wants to kind of gain independence and be respected for himself, and he like wants to set his own boundaries essentially. And this is kind of like, I got a lot of like civil rights movement like feeling from this. Like, if like this felt like it was a science fiction story like in a 1950s 1960s historical piece skin suit in a way. And if you took the like jazz elements out of this and stuff, I felt like the story would just like, it doesn't have enough science fiction to carry it without this like layer of jazz era and civil rights movement. What's the word? Like talking points, essentially. And I get it, it's interesting, but I just felt like I didn't see a point for these characters to be robots when they could have just been people, because like I feel like there's a difference with how people view people versus robots that they have prior to in history to have thought to be like objects and utilitarian like machines that do grunt work. And I get that there is a sort of allegory to be had with these robots to like the struggle of Black people against Jim Crow and slavery. That is a very non-subtle allegory at play here. But I also think that it isn't a one-to-one connection, and to make it seem like it is a one-to-one connection is kind of a false idea. So I personally didn't I personally did not like it as much, and also I think that it wasn't a very successful in bringing that across. So this was my least favorite one, and this one kind of felt a little chore-ish to read, because it was like there was not as much like character as there was just regurgitating these like talking points of like character has suffered, character doesn't want to suffer anymore, character gets upset because they don't get treated the way they want to, and they move on. Like it follows these kind of points without actually like fleshing anything out. So yeah, like this was a pass for me. And then the last fiction story before I move into the non-fiction side of things is The Body of Theseus by Emir G. Park. And this one was also pretty interesting. This one successfully does the thing that the trumpet player in the previous story was trying to do, in my opinion. The Body of Theseus kind of examines this idea of it's another story with a robot uprising, and but there's also this idea that because people have become so used to this idea of like androids doing the grunt work in every way possible and in everyday life and stuff, they have had androids and robots to do the work. And now that they are rebelling and the United States is in a state of basically a kind of civil war, because these robots are rebelling against their masters, and like and there's fighting in like the Midwest and stuff. There is this new kind of underclass of people who have been implanted with this sort of thing called permit, which is sort of like a chip embedded in your neck that sends you signals when you are not doing the thing that the corporate entity wants you to be doing. For example, if you don't wake up when you need to, it will send you a signal that like floods your bloodstream with like hormones and like steroids so that you wake up and things like that. So it's another story that deals with the idea of subservience and this idea of what freedom looks like, and why we covet it, and why we as people need freedom, and why that is a human right, essentially, to like have agency over your own body and to govern your own self. And I feel like it did this very successfully. There's basically a person who is kind of forced to do this salvage work in these flooded old ruins of the United States, like for example Miami, and he is way behind on his loans, and bills are piling up, and he has to take this kind of dangerous jobs, and he has also taken on other loans to be able to afford this permit chip that you need to install in your neck to like get certain kinds of jobs from certain kinds of companies. So this is the kind of character that we have as the main character, this character that is very desperate and very down on their luck and in need of security. And he meets the leader of the Android Rebellion, and they sort of have this talk, and they are both kind of on the like ends of the spectrum in a sense. And I thought that this story was really interesting. I felt like it didn't really go anywhere. Like, it kind of had this problem of not being a complete arc with a beginning, middle, and end. It just kind of left at the setup phase. Like, it sets you up for the story to go somewhere, and then it kind of like leaves it open, to like interpretation. Whereas I personally, when I come into a story, I want to read the whole story. Even in a short story format, you don't need to make it complex. You don't need to like do like a long arc. Like, you can keep it simple, and you can just decide to cover a narrow topic, just make it a whole arc. This one kind of just like, okay, I'm gonna set you up for a story point, and then you figure out the rest, because this is where the story ends. So that was kind of like unsatisfactory. Yes, focus. So yeah, not my favorite, but definitely not my least favorite. And finally, I am going to talk about the nonfiction piece, which is The Answer by K.L. Bird. And this talks about the importance of a community coming together, and the idea of like how, even if we want justice, even if we want to do something as an individual, us doing something as an individual is not as impactful or helpful as like doing something as a group. For example, that's how protests work. You go in as a group to express what you want to convey to the ruling body to make change. A single voice is always like lost in the crowd, but when you are part of the crowd, working towards the same goal, that's when you get powerful. And it ties this idea. The essay ties this idea to the idea of a Black community, and how this idea of joy and pain in the Black community being interlinked. I thought that it was a really interesting essay. Would highly recommend you read it, and it definitely gave me a lot of like things to like think about when I think about the like experiences of different marginalized communities, how they navigate that world of how their communities and how individuals within those communities are in relation to like other like larger populations in the same society that they inhabit. Definitely a worthy read. If I would say like three things to read from this collection, would be Smiley Faces with Blackberry Jam on Toast by Cynthia S. Scott. When I Fell Apart, My Mother Put Me Back Together by Renee S. Christopher, and The Answer by K.L. Bird. So you get fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. So those would be my picks as the standouts for this magazine. And yeah, this has been a very short live stream, like half an hour, but that's what I expected doing this by myself. Hopefully next month I will have a co-host. We will be talking about, let me just quickly have a cheat sheet here so that I know what I am talking about. Beep. Next month, we are going to be discussing Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit indigiqueer and indigiqueer speculative fiction edited by Joshua Whitehead. This is an anthology of short stories, and we will be discussing this book this month in March. And I will have the Goodreads like discussion pages up by tomorrow, and hopefully in the first Saturday of April we will have a discussion about this anthology. And I can't wait. And yes, Joe, exactly. I am kind of finding that I'm kind of finding that I do in fact have a soft spot for poetry now. I feel like my problem is currently that I don't have much experience with genre related poetry specifically. I read a lot of like Finnish poetry and like what you would call like contemporary poetry, but when poetry tries to tackle topics of like relevant to fantasy and science fiction, that's where I feel a little bit lost because I am not used to it. So I am trying to get out of my comfort zone and get more immersed in that. So yeah, and thank you for being here to keep me company. And yeah, I will see you in the next live show, hopefully on the first Saturday of April. And before that, I will hopefully have some videos coming out. And yeah, bye bye. Thank you for hanging out. See you.